right, I will begin recording. So welcome everybody. My name is Amy. I am the Philadelphia City Center Director for IIDA. I'm also an interior designer at Nelson's Philadelphia office. I am based in Philly. I really appreciate all of you coming here tonight to join in on our Design for Y'all panel, which is a little joke because Philadelphians love to use the word y'all. It's very colloquial here in our part of the city. And also the Human Rights Campaign celebrates the word y'all because it's incredibly inclusive. It's a word that doesn't belong to any particular group of people. It's a word that does not assign gender to any particular group, and it's extremely welcoming and very just friendly, you know. So a few more people are joining in here. I'm going to share my screen and give a quick announcement of our panelists, and then we will jump into questions. So give me 1 second. All right, everybody can see. Thumbs up from someone. All right, excellent. So panelist number 1, we're just going to go in alphabetical order, is Chris Congdon. Chris is the editor-in-chief of 360 Magazine, a Steelcase publication, website, podcast, and webinar series that shares research about the future of work and the workplace. She is a principal author of 360 Global Reports on the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of work and employee engagement. Chris is also a co-author of Balancing We and Me, featured in Harvard Business Review, and a regular speaker and panelist about a range of workplace issues. She and her team focus on key issues such as inclusion, creating community at work, engagement, neuroscience, privacy, and is currently exploring how the workplace will change in the near and long term as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Next, we have Roby Isaac. So with 20 years in the design industry, Roby is responsible for the design direction of a talented design team that creates for all product categories. An apprenticeship at a contemporary art studio in Philadelphia led him to explore a life of textiles, and he hasn't looked back since. After graduating with a degree in textile design, concentration in weaving, he started his career as a product designer. Now with Mannington Commercial for 10 years, he leads the design studio with a call to action to being open to explore and experience. Welcome. Next, we have Juniper Moscow, who is a high school senior at Springside Chestnut Hill Academy with a strong interest in architecture and design. Next year, she will attend Tufts University of Engineering and is planning on majoring in their interdisciplinary architecture major. In high school, she has been involved in diversity work and various sports, but mostly she spends her time listening to music, spending time outside, reading and watching movies, and drawing. She really enjoys observing the world around her and thinking about how she could apply that to the built environment. As an architect, Juniper would like to create beautiful spaces that can act as monuments to culture and identity. A fun fact about Juniper is that she thinks brunch is the best American tradition, and honestly, I agree.
Hello.
Last but not least, we have Reuben Quoi Capone. He is a designer with experience designing movie theaters, industrial, and retail spaces around the States. He is currently working on new projects for a major, globally renowned client. His work is focused on creating artistic narratives. He co-founded Designing in Color with his friends, Opalia Mead and Christopher Locke, while at University of Michigan's Taubman Grad School, specifically to diversify the way that architecture was taught and practiced. In what little spare time he has, Reuben pursues an active art and photography business, selling his works online and doing frequent photo shoots from his home base in Seattle. He has unsuccessfully tried multiple times to understand the appeal of Taylor Swift, which is a controversial and hot take, but another one that I agree with.
I stand by it.
Love a hot take. All right, just gonna stop sharing for 1 minute here so that I can admit the most recent guests to our waiting room, and then we're gonna get into some questions. Just wanted to say another welcome to everybody who joined a little bit late. We just introduced all of our panelists, and I'm excited for this discussion. The way we're going to handle it this evening is I have a read up to each question that provides a little bit of historical context. Please let me know if there are any questions that you have specifically for the panelists on each topic. And you can send them at any time in the chat and I will read them out. I'll be moderating it throughout the event this evening. But yeah, just looking forward to the conversation that we all have. Okay, getting my bearings here and then I'll begin to read. All right, back to sharing. So our first question is on the unchanging world of architecture and design. Buckminster Fuller once noted that he felt that he himself is a verb and not a noun. I seem to be a verb, an evolutionary process, an integral function of the universe. He studied himself as an evolving and shifting individual in an ever-changing world of which we will never truly be a part. This view into the metaphysical applies to the layers of the human experience in the built environment. With the restroom remaining largely the same for decades and the continuous overturning and denouncement of progressive spaces, it can be argued that architecture and design are largely unchanged by the human experience. We can come to understand individuals who are different from us by acknowledging that all bodies are verbs. They are becoming and they are unbecoming. They are doing and they are undoing. They are changing and they are reactionary. We share this state of constant change in common, as no bodily form remains unchanged throughout a lifetime. Historically, architecture and design have been associated with masculinity, and the building or the city has been associated with femininity, creating a cloudy conflation of gender binary and control. The study of anarchitecture, one word, views these inconsistent, inaccurate, and unchanging norms in design, such as the association of the female body with the domestic home, as barriers to freedom and thus must be destroyed. How do we, as designers, architects, and individuals interested in design and architecture, create meaningful changes in the built environment, such as putting an end to cities segregated through gentrification and class war, an end to the commodification of shared public green spaces, and ultimately convince clients that their projects can be an opportunity to see the world in a different way? What role can art play to herald in positive change? So, big question. I'm going to punt to Roby first. Roby, what do you think?
You gave me an easy one. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. That's one that we could definitely unpack. And so if I could, I'm going to try to dissect it. I'm going to take your question, maybe dissect it into two pieces. And one thing that resonated or struck a chord with me was this idea or the topic of gentrification. And I'd like to touch on that and then tie it back into, I think, how clients can be supportive in positivity or in the positive changes with their projects. So, I think that most of us would agree that the idea of beautifying or, making a space improved isn't a bad thing. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, And I loosely say improved because I think there's another conversation about, what is that idea of improvement from past to future, right? But if we're talking about just the beautification of a space, right, as it relates to gentrification, I think that's the idea of beautification is why we all, came into the world of art and design. I think we all grew up having these ideas or visions of things in front of us, and we wanted to make them better or cooler or whatever you want to call it. And then we chose the paths that we did because we needed to understand the tools we needed to, make those changes happen in real life. But I think that the argument that gentrification takes the necessary steps to make things better falls short because, as I see it, it's really about what you see on the surface. It's the optics, it's the cool graphics, it's the really fabulous storefront, maybe the really unique products that are being sold in the space. But and by the way, I think there's value in that. If you want to have a successful business, if you're entrepreneurial and you want to attract business, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think the problem that I have is that these businesses or these entities try to get into the space or try to become part of the space, and when they get in, they almost try to separate themselves and be don't want to be part of the space. They want to say, all right, we're almost better than what was here before. And I think that's the thing that is really hurtful. It's the idea that a lot of these entities or businesses or whatever almost have this idea that there was nothing of value in that place before they were there. And by the way, I know I'm talking in generalizations. I know that there are a lot of businesses and groups that come in and enter a community and are supportive. So I think that the opportunity that the A&D community has specifically is for these A&D firms to guide their clients into these really valuable conversations of how to become part of that community. I think one critical piece is talking to the clients about what's happening in the area, both the good and the bad. I think from the bit of research that I've done on this, a lot of times, the projects are spoken about with, what the future looks like, and doesn't really take into account, how to address the needs that are present in that community. And I think that, from a project perspective, maybe there is an opportunity for a design firm to work with the client to almost build it into the scope of work. All right, what can be done from almost a civic sense to align some of these, these businesses with nonprofit groups or community organizers to say, all right, these are real issues. As you're kind of progressing and building the space up, how do we also address these, critical needs of the community that built that, or the residents that built that community. And I think that if that happens, there are a lot of really great things happen. You're almost in this partnership, of building the space together. But then you also have these businesses that have sort of some civic pull and maybe financial pull or financial resource to get things happening. So, and then in terms of Buckminster Fuller, I'm a big fan, and I kind of agree with this ideology of, things always are moving, so you have to change with it. And I think there's an important piece there where the A&D groups can talk to their clients about that. I think there's a traditional way of looking at spaces. All right, I'm going to spend this money. I want the space to look like this. It's going to be like that for, 5 to 7 years or whatever it might be like. And then they're going to get a refresh. But I think as time progresses and there are new social and cultural needs, that we have to transform or get into the conversation about transforming these spaces to be a lot more modular, and how do we build these spaces so that it's not rigid and static, right? And I think that as those conversations happen and the clients become more aware of the importance of that these changes will, happen.
Yeah, I really like that question quite a bit. And I appreciate Robbie's answer, especially bringing up gentrification. James Baldwin called gentrification Negro removal. That's what it is, essentially. It's a purely racist policy. It's clothed in economic concerns to make it seem more palatable. But at its core, it's basically taken away space from marginalized communities to make communities that already have plenty even richer. That's really all it is, to me anyway. So I appreciate that we at least touched on it. I think it's really problematic in so many ways. I think gentrified communities have been shown, gentrification has a negative effect on health. People who have been gentrified have higher rates of cancer, they die sooner, they have just a poorer quality of life overall. It's like an actively antagonistic move. Generally speaking, though, I think as designers, we're really powerful. And I think our strength isn't just the built environment, it's the ability to create images. And I think the imagery is what is far and away the most powerful tool we have. The ability to create an idea that someone can see, recognize, empathize with, and kind of leverage into policy or action is incredibly powerful. And it's something we don't think about all the time. We make so many renders and the goal is to sell product. But what if we take that ability we have and work with a community or an organization, do pro bono work, come up with a vision of the community center they're trying to build or the historical building they want to save? Why can't we put our powers to work in that sense? We are architects, we are salespeople to a degree, but we have the ability to be generators of incredible social change if we just put our skills to intriguing uses.
Mm-hmm. You know, listening to you guys talk is making me think about a book I read last year. It's called Palaces for the People. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's the author's name is Eric Kleinenberg, I think. But what he was talking about is communities that are resilient, and in the face of some sort of crisis, there are some communities that fare really poorly and others that do quite well. And the ones that were most resilient from his work were the ones where there was that sense of community that you're talking about, and social spaces where people gathered, whether it be libraries or community centers or places. And I know that's, you know, clearly been really difficult this year, but places that bring people together to create that sense of belonging and togetherness that, you know, sometimes when the community's been gentrified, you lose that sense of people feeling that belongingness. And, you know, it can be designed for, you know, it can be thoughtfully created, you know, and that's a great role that those of you who are designers can help us all with, is to try and create those types of things.
I also really liked what you had to say about, especially the beauty part, because that was the part of the question I latched onto in a way. Because it's just, I don't know that much about architecture and design, but I do think a lot about beauty. And I really liked what you had to say about gentrified spaces being kind of beautiful on the surface level. And I even think that often they take away from the, like, there's genuine beauty in the communities that they come into, and often they like convert that into surface level, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think I don't really have an answer for that, but when I was looking at the question, I do think that beauty is a really enticing way to create change, because if you think of like some of the most famous architects or artists, Picasso, Frank Lloyd Wright, to name like probably the two most known, I guess, in Western art, which is a problem in itself. But it's always about change, and I think that I imagine that clients always want to create beautiful spaces, and creating a space that's like at the crux of change is a really good way to do that.
Yeah, I think that you really hit it. That's an excellent point sort of to end on for this question. I think the idea that beauty can be inaccessible and that it's only for certain people, right? And that the inherent beauty in a community can be the fact that it's diverse, that it has its own culture, that it's constantly changing, and not that commercialized type of beauty where people come in and they build these luxury high rises with luxury grocery stores and gyms that are only available to tenants, and nobody can go to them except for the rich people who live in them. It just makes beauty so incredibly inaccessible. And I think that
and I think, if I can add, Amy, I think that a lot of times, you know, when these areas are sort of revitalized or whatever you want to call it, it starts to negate the beauty of the culture that built that space. So whatever was there, and the residents that have built that community, the vibe that the residents are living in, you know, somebody comes in and says, well, this won't work. I'm going to put, like, to your point, I'm going to put this high rise up. I'm going to put this luxury grocery store, boutique grocery store, whatever, you know, then you start continuing this conversation, or this unspoken conversation, that these things are bad, right? And that's dangerous. And it, you know, I think, you know, I'll admit I'm at fault. Like I'll go to these stores and stuff like that because there's like something that's appealing to it. But I mean, you know, it goes back to that, like that surface, you know, conversation. It's just surface level, like, but what are we doing to say, all right, there is beauty in this, and how do we encourage or support that, and still do all the, you know, the things that people talk about gentrification being good for, you know, revitalizing the space, energizing the community, putting revenue back into it, because in reality, it's not happening, right? Because the revenue is not going back into the community, it's going into the pockets of people that are making these buildings and businesses.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think Itasha Womack said, a choice you don't know is a choice you don't have. If we're trying to convince clients to think outside the box, we have to show them. I think a lot of these kind of pushes with gentrification, it's all in the pursuit of a kind of utopia, a utopic vision where everything is beautiful and aligned. But the fallacy with the utopia is that it creates a dystopia for everyone else. So it's like, which group are you in? You know, it's really great if you're in the utopic version, but it's horrible if you're not. So how can we just make people more aware of that dichotomy? You know, it's too easy to see inside the bubble you're in, basically. We can just show clients more than what they typically see. I think that can help a lot.
Yeah.
And besides, who wants to live in a utopia anyway? Utopias are boring. They're inherently boring. They're not diverse. They're not interesting. They're not challenging. So, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Would any of the other panelists like to add anything more before we move to the next question?
No,
All right, okay. I shall move right along. All right, everyone should be able to see my screen again. So we're moving on to topic number 2, gendered spaces and trans bodies. The restroom has long been a battleground for inequality. Dating back to France in the 18th century, workspaces had to add in women-specific restrooms because women were finally, in a limited way, allowed to enter a previously male workspace. Before, during, and after the victories won by the civil rights movement in America in the 1950s and 60s, segregated restrooms are one of the many spaces used to proliferate a narrative of racial hierarchy. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in order to make buildings safer and fairer for people with disabilities, including specific requirements for easy-to-use restrooms. And under the Reagan administration in the 1980s, during the height of the largely ignored and unfairly scandalized AIDS crisis, men's restrooms were lauded as locations to pick up a deadly virus. An excellent case study of restroom-oriented hatred towards trans bodies hails from Houston, Texas in 2015. The tagline, "No men in women's bathrooms," was used as a misguided anti-trans rallying cry to instill fear in cisgendered individuals that cis women were at risk of assault by transgender women if they are permitted to share a restroom. Following events like these, companies around the world have researched, programmed, planned, studied, and executed test sites in order to figure out what the best restroom is, which keeps everyone safe. The conclusion is a free-flowing space with floor-to-ceiling privacy stalls to be shared by all, with the inclusion of ADA-compliant stalls, a communal barrier-free area for hand-washing at varying heights, and space to touch up one's appearance. An overall lack of gender binary and association allows for any type of gender identity to use the only type of restroom provided, whereas simply allowing trans people to use one of 2 gender binaried restrooms upholds and maintains the idea that the idea that individuals should be separated in cheaply stalled restrooms with gaping partitions and still limits overall gender expression to that of male and female. This historical context and precedent study leads us to the question, how can we influence for our clients and customers a more thoughtful approach to gendered spaces, such as locker rooms and restrooms? What role can we play in instilling in our clients a higher understanding of how space limits individual freedom of expression and furthers a narrative of a right way to exist in the design space? And how does the traditional binary of gendered spaces negatively impact trans communities? So I think that, perfect timing, right, with Trans Visibility Day being yesterday. And I saw a really interesting tweet that really caught my attention, and it said, visibility is one thing, but visibility without protection and access to resources is just a trap. And I really think that, these 2 things have to go hand in hand, right? But one way that we can start as designers and architects and folks who work in this space is to begin insisting to clients that we want restrooms that are free-flowing, that have no gender binary, right? Maybe that's just one place that we can start. And Juniper, I'd love to pass this question to you to kick us off. I think you have some pretty strong opinions on this issue.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Again, it's a big one. And I think firstly, I'd like to address the way that gendered spaces right now negatively impact the trans community. And I'd also like to say that, I identify as part of the LGBT community, but I'm not trans. So I'm not, I wish there could be a better person to speak on this. But as part of the community, I have heard from a lot of, and as a high schooler, I have heard from a lot of kids in high school who identify as trans, be it non-binary or, trans male, trans female. And there's really no good way that any high school around me has done it. If the high school does allow trans students to go into the restroom of their choice, often they feel uncomfortable in the restroom they would choose from because of students' reactions and because of even teachers' reactions. If the school has a non-gendered bathroom, which is a substantial improvement, it's often tucked away in some gym somewhere halfway across the campus. If you have one non-gendered bathroom for a total of 20 gendered bathrooms in a space, that's not sufficient, because students have told me they'll be 20 minutes late for class just going a 10-minute walk to the bathroom and then back. And then even I think one of the most harmful things I've heard of is the reactions of the administration and teachers who are just not accommodating to trans kids' wishes in terms of bathrooms, and will like scoff at them or, you know, be condescending in many ways. So that's what I'd like to say about the negative impact. It really does make whatever way you feel uncomfortable about having non-gendered bathrooms or having open spaces in terms of bathrooms, that's like an actual discomfort that I think is, if we didn't address it, it would be kind of ignoring the problem. Like there is a very big bias we have for gendered bathrooms, and I think almost everyone feels uncomfortable in some way with the idea of changing that norm. But that bias and like that amount of discomfort we have is so little and such an easy thing to fix compared to the discomfort the trans community feels. And I think that if you don't keep that in mind, you're what's the word? Can't think of the word. You're not acknowledging the experience of the trans community. And that's really, oh, and then addressing the other parts of the question, I think it can tie back to what we were talking about with like the beauty, and like you said, it was the best research option for that non-gendered bathroom that you had on the screen. Like that's a good option. It not only is it like a way to make everyone feel safer, it's also like a good option. Like I think that that's an important thing to say as well.
You know, I would love to just say, Juniper, first of all, thank you for, you know, raising the issue and talking about it with all of us. And thank you to you, Amy, for talking about the topic. And I love what you were saying earlier. I won't get it quite right, but the quote that you heard from Twitter, the one about it being about you need protection as well. I would say, like, I always took using the bathroom for granted, just totally for granted, never even really thought about it until the reality of my son, who is transgender, has had dangerous situations using a gendered bathroom. And, you know, I never thought about it before. And that awareness for me now, it just makes it so much more clear that this is an issue that goes beyond just, it might go beyond, you know, like things that a lot of the cisgender community has never really thought about before. But there's a whole portion of society that really can't have a basic human right of being able to go to the bathroom safely. And when it seems like it's a problem that is not difficult to solve at all. When I traveled to China before the pandemic, you know, the bathrooms that we used were gender neutral. They were non-binary, and it was fine. It was perfectly natural and normal, you know, and it was designed in a very similar way to the thought starter that you were showing us, Amy. So I'm just hoping that more designers will begin to think about that in the spaces that they build, so they make sure that they think through the full experience of people using a space and make sure that it's equitable for everybody.
You know, Chris, you mentioned something. It became more of a important matter when it was more personal, right? I mean, I'll admit, like, I never really have thought about it, and it's through dialogue and even things like this, where as someone that doesn't think about it, if we don't talk about it, it doesn't become an important thing to resolve. Mm-hmm. You know, and I like you, Chris, in travels, there's a lot of places that are gender neutral bathrooms. I don't even think about it. I just go in, you know, and then go wash my hands or whatever. I mean, even in places, in cities and across America, like restaurants, like a lot of retail places, it's happening. And so in my mind, I just kind of think it's happening everywhere, but I guess the reality is that it's not. And to Juniper's comments, I mean, if it's not happening, you know, with our children and their spaces, you know, it's really not, you know, it needs to be addressed so our children feel safe.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question, and thank you, Juniper, for speaking to it, and Chris and Robbie as well. But when I think about this question, I think it's just an issue of like true versus performative empathy from a lot of clients. So last year was when a lot of clients were like, "Hey, we're pro-Black now," you know, and it took like a murder for them to realize how tough it is. Yeah, I hate that that's what empathy seems to build from. It has to reach a boiling point before people care. All the micro, you know, aggressions or even horrible things that happened, as long as it's not, it has to come out at the right time for the news cycle to make it big for anyone to see it and for anyone to care and do anything about it. I think now that clients have kind of put themselves out and said like, you know, statements of diversity and inclusion, we have to hold them to that standard. It doesn't just apply to Black bodies, it applies to gendered spaces, it applies to trans bodies. It can be, you can't pick and choose what you're being, I guess, forward thinking about. You can't pick and choose what you advocate for in the diversity sphere. So I would love to see, you know, standards for design. Like we shouldn't have to think about empathy when we design something. It should just be it should be born to us to make a space that's fair for everybody. And the fact that it isn't is really sad. In Mismatch, Kat Holmes talks about designing for all solves, or designing for one solves problems for all. And I think that's such a cool approach to it. It's like, like when you go to a space with a ramp, you don't even think about how convenient it is to have a ramp there. Because it's great. Who's ever complained about not having to go upstairs? It's awesome. But it's not designed for you, but it benefits you. And I think that's how a lot of cool designs like this are. Like empathetic design helps everyone, right? Should be a no-brainer.
Yeah, I love the point that you just made about performative diversity and empathy. You know, this conversation sort of came about because, you know, I was thinking that, you know, it's very nice that a lot of companies are coming out with these diversity and inclusion councils. Of course, it's extremely lame and uncool and unfair and unjust that it took this long and this type of activity to create things like this. But at the same time, you know, we're only talking about people of color. And I think that we have to have those conversations, but we can't leave out all of the other minority groups that are actively hurt by the built space. And I can't imagine what it would be like personally to go into a space and not know what restroom I'm allowed to use because I'm not being told that there's a space for me. I'm not being given a space to be myself. And, you know, when you think about like the way that building codes are even written, it's like, you know, based on how many men and women are in a space, this is how many, you know, toilet fixture counts, how many urinals, how many labs that you need to have. But it's like, what if there were just that quantity in a space that everybody could use? You know, there's nothing telling us that we need to or we have to have signs up that have a triangle for a girl and, you know, a more masculine, quote unquote, figure for you know, a gender binary male. It just, all of this is made up and it's not something we need to continue to do. And so it's like, if we can start this with one client, we can have this conversation where, you know, restroom upgrades are needed anyway. What if we just said, let's take the signs off the doors. Let's make it a space that everyone can share. There are lots of restaurants that are already doing it, at least in the city of Philadelphia, where you go into one room and there's a row of sinks and floor to ceiling stalls. And overall, it's a better experience because personally, I like the level of privacy in a, you know, a floor to ceiling stall in a bathroom. I don't love going into those plasticky toilet partitions that have the big gaps in them. And, you know, it just feels like you're completely exposed. And, you know, I absolutely hate the conservative talking point that allowing, you know, different people into a gender binary bathroom is unsafe. Well, it's unsafe for people to not have a space to go. And I mean, this infuriates me. And And, you know, I want us to continue to talk about this, and I want it to be a part of every project that everyone works on from here on out. I demand it.
Amy, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So in your projects that you worked on, do you feel like there's pushback from clients when you present this idea?
I have to tell you that in 5 years of working as a professional, I have only had one opportunity to design a restroom that is considered open for everybody. One out of hundreds of projects that I've worked on. And, you know, to be completely honest, the past 3 years maybe, this didn't even come into my mind because, as you mentioned, this isn't an issue that affects me personally. It doesn't affect, you know, a lot of the people that I'm close with personally. And so my ignorance was just a mistake. I didn't know that this was something that I needed to be aware of. And now that I am, I think about it on every project. And, you know, I also don't have a lot of opportunities to affect restrooms because many of them are existing to remain. You know, I do a lot of work for tenants in a space where the restroom is maintained by the building and we don't need to do any upgrades to it. So, you know, we can, you know, we just keep business as usual. But I will say that personally, from here on out, on every project that I have an opportunity to either add in restrooms or affect the restrooms in the space, this will be a talking point, a demand.
You know, I would just add as a very practical thing for clients, just a story within the space that I work in. We just took the gender, you know, off the door, and, you know, the door's locked, it's fine. And where we used to have a problem because one bathroom was getting more heavily trafficked than the other one, as soon as we took the gender off, then there were more spaces available. And so very pragmatically, you know, it's to your point, Reuben, that one thing that serves one can serve us all because it just made it a lot easier for everybody. So, you know, I think if you had any objections from clients, that might be a very simple story to think about.
A great real world example.
Yeah.
I really liked your example too, Chris, of the of just traveling overseas and not seeing the gender binary problem with restrooms. Do you think this is sort of a Western issue, or is it unique to the US, or like why do you think that is?
Oh gosh, I truly have no idea, Reuben. I really couldn't tell you. You know, maybe it was in this situation because you know, space is at such a premium. You know, maybe they needed to think through the bathroom situation in a different way as opposed to, you know, how the space was allocated. I couldn't tell you because, you know, honestly, I've been in a lot of different places, and there've been a lot of, you know, you learn a lot about a culture when you when you use bathrooms. I mean, there's just, it's one of those experiences that we all share as human beings.
Actually, I have a little bit of like a historical answer to that question that I learned while I was researching this topic a bit. So, you know, when I think I mentioned on the first slide, you know, restrooms were originally very male-centric, right? Because it was only like cis men in the workplace back in the 1800s, back in the Victorian era. But when women were finally allowed to enter the workplace at the height of the Victorian era in England, you know, women would wear these like extremely large ball gowns, right? Like when you see pictures of Victorian England, everybody was wearing a gown with multiple petticoats, and you know, cis women were expected to have a certain aesthetic, like a certain beauty, right? Like everyone wore sort of makeup and had very done up hair. And this like extremely pronounced gender binary was formed in England. And so, you know, obviously as Americans, we take a lot of our cues from the English, you know, what with history and such, you know, we're very like Anglo-Saxon as a country, or at least that's how we were founded. And so that extremely gendered space sort of came over to the US because the restrooms had to be bigger to accommodate these gowns. They had mirrors, whereas like men's restrooms, the men, you know, back at the time, they were just like going into a restroom, using it and leaving. Whereas like women were, you know, they had to like primp themselves, I guess, to, you know, maintain that level of beauty expected in the Victorian era. So I guess I can't say like why it still is this way. You know, I guess I could say that it's hatred and, you know, poor values, but that's where it came from originally.
It's really good to know. Thanks.
All right, we actually have one question in the chat about this topic that I'd love to ask before we move on to the next one. It says, is it possible to also suggest to clients when restroom spaces are maintained by the building that the current standard is becoming non-gendered in a nudge to move things forward from the property management front, which can affect many spaces versus just the one? Well, from interacting with clients' perspective, I would say that, yeah, we can certainly talk about that, and we probably should. I think that it's a conversation we can have. We do a lot of negotiating with brokers, especially when it comes to lease stuff. And if we are able to get in front of a client, tell a client that it's important, get them on board, and they try to negotiate up, building upgrades like those in a lease. That's definitely something.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think when it comes to standards, clients trust us as designers, right? We have a lot of pull in how we word things and convince them. And honestly, this should be standard anyway, right? I think that's a really interesting way to frame it, to get people to buy into it, because it's kind of a no-brainer. I see so many comments right now about how much better gender-neutral bathrooms are, and it's like, yeah, of course.
I think it's kind of interesting because I was having this discussion a little bit with my family in the past couple of days after reading the questions from you, Amy. And I mean, it's different generations, right? But even my brother, who's 2 years younger than me, goes to the same school, he was kind of telling me that he thinks that an all-gendered space would be more dangerous for women because men could take advantage, which I don't really think it's true, because men can already take advantage of women in a woman's best bathroom if there's no one around, which is the case in either situation. But I think it's just interesting coming to this space where everyone is so positive about it and sees all the positive sides about it, which isn't really helpful if you're talking to someone who only sees the negative sides and you don't really address those negative sides of it and you don't find answers and reassurances about those. Although obviously having more positives and negatives is always a good thing. But yeah, I just wanted to say that. Not really sure where I was supposed to go.
It's a great point. I'm also happy to see all of the wonderful positive comments in the chat about thinking that this is a great idea and practically a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else want to add anything before we move to question number 3? All right, and we can come back to this topic. It seems like it's one of great interest to a lot of folks. So if we have some more time for Q&A at the end, keep the questions coming. Okay, let me go back to Sharon. Okay, so topic number 3 is about the exacerbation of inequality in the time of COVID. With the necessity of working from home for a large number of people throughout the world during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, inequalities among class, race, and gender lines have become clearer than ever. The majority of essential workers at grocery stores, fast food chains, gas stations, and public health centers, as well as sanitation workers and warehouse workers, have had to continuously risk their lives by going into work every day. In many cases, this has been without hazard pay, appropriate PPE, and the ability to take off time with pay if the worker becomes infected with COVID. Half of minimum wage workers are considered essential workers. Out of the total population working minimum wage jobs, 2/3 are women and 80% are adults, contrary to the popular narrative that most minimum wage workers are teenagers with after-school jobs. About 1/4 of minimum wage workers are women of color. We see this inequality across the country, focused in major metropolitan areas, and yet it doesn't touch many of us because we have white-collar jobs with the ability to work from home. But even the home can serve as an example of a different type of inequality. Workers who do not have home offices are less likely to experience career growth. Cis women with children are often doing the lion's share of parenting while working full-time from home due to the lack of childcare, and the care a physical school building provides, and much more. What inequities have you seen during this remote working, remote learning time, and how can the physical office serve as an equalizer in a post-pandemic world? What lessons can we learn from the time away from the office in order to make the office and the company a better and more equitable place? So I'm going to hand this over to Chris. I know you have so much to say on the topic, and feel free to share your screen too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm particularly passionate about this issue, and you know, there's been so much that's been written, which is good that it's acknowledging how hard this pandemic has been on all of us, but particularly for women. And so Amy graciously said I could share some things with you. I don't want to do like a boring PowerPoint presentation, but I couldn't figure out how to share this with you without a few slides. So if you bear with me, I'm going to show some things. Also bear with me because as soon as I try and do full screen view, for some reason, it blows up the Zoom meeting. So you get to see my whole slide shorter view, which will is not always the best way to share stuff, but I hope you'll forgive me for that. So, so we were really surprised, you know, because a lot of us tend to think that, you know, when we have the opportunity to work from home, that's a good thing. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but what we discovered through some research that we just finished in December is that there's actually some hidden biases. And we looked into 4 different typical types of spaces that people work in. We set out just to understand the differences in their experiences. But in the middle of it, we found something that was really pretty interesting. So I won't linger on this, this particular slide because you can see it's really complicated in terms of the research methodology, but there's basically a lot of different variables that would go into somebody's experience in working from home, and their demographics, you know, in terms of gender, age, income, etc., have an impact. So any of these little lines kind of represent that there's a connection, and the thicker the line, the bigger the connection. So if you can see in the middle of the screen that dot that says work from home conditions, the conditions really impact people's well-being and stress, which in turn impacts their ability to feel part of a team, to be deeply engaged, and to be really productive. So of course, we want to understand, well, what are those conditions all about? And so what we started finding, first of all, there were kind of 4 key ways that people were working from home. Some people had a dedicated home office, which was like a private room with a door. There was an office before the pandemic, and then it got kind of fully deployed to be an office full time. There are also the work zones where people within their home kind of carved a space out of an existing room. So maybe they used a screen or a bookcase, or we saw some people who were using sheets, but they actually created kind of a little mini office within a larger room. And then there was another type of space where it was like a multi-purpose area within the home where, you know, like the dining room table, this is a pretty common story. The dining room table kind of got taken over, and one end became kind of the work zone and the other end became the dining zone. And then there are also folks who have what we call temporary setups, meaning I'm working from the kitchen counter, the sofa. I don't really have a place within my home where I'm working. And without going through all of the details beneath, some of the patterns were really pretty interesting. So we saw that the people who have home offices, dedicated home offices, were much more likely to be men. They were much more likely to be in a leadership role with higher income, and their working conditions were better because, you know, they had more privacy, they had more control over their space, they had better furniture. And you know, as you work kind of from the left to the right, the situations got less advantageous for people. So in the work zones, it was about half male and women, people who are still in leadership roles, but a little bit less, and pretty average income. but as you move to the multipurpose areas and the temporary setups, you can see that these were more likely to be women, and in a temporary setup, predominantly women, predominantly people who were lower income, who very few of them were in leadership roles. And they didn't have privacy. They had lots of distractions, and they didn't have the same advantages of kind of, you know, a great chair, and their technology was okay, but not great. And so what we found about that, that's the part that's really concerning, is that as we scored this out, you could see on that top bar that the work from home conditions got worse as you moved from somebody who had a private home office to somebody who was in a temporary setup. And then along with that, people's stress levels, which were connected to those conditions, got higher. So stress went up as the work from home conditions went down. And then I don't think it would surprise anybody to see that productivity numbers also started to go down. And I would point out that, you know, even though it's not like this, you know, this steep slope that you might expect to see, anything that's 2 points or higher is really significant. So if you had productivity scores, you know, up in the 70s for people who had a home office and down in the 60s for people who don't, you can see that that makes a big difference. And the same thing happened with their engagement skills or scores as well, that people's engagement levels would drop off. And what we know about engagement is that people who are highly engaged are those folks who kind of go the extra mile. And the people who are less engaged are the people who kind of do just enough to get by. And that really sets women up for a very inequitable situation. And so, you know, the thing that we took away from all of this is that, you know, while working from home can absolutely be a benefit, and I know there are plenty of us who have found some autonomy and freedom being able to work from home, I think it's important that we recognize and are aware that it's there's two sides to the coin, so to speak, and that what can happen is that you've basically got kind of haves and have-nots who may have been haves and have-nots in the office, and now that problem is potentially being exacerbated at home. And so organizations really need to think about how they better support people who have to work from home, whether they have to work from home just during the pandemic, or if the organization has made a decision that that's something that's going to be an ongoing strategy. It can be really an issue, again, particularly for women. And even though in our research we didn't dig into issues like caregiving roles or, you know, responsibilities with children or parents, I think we know enough to be able to surmise that, you know, and there's been plenty of other research in this space suggesting that that's also an unequal burden that has been happening during the course of the pandemic. So thanks for letting me use a few slides to kind of help illuminate that research a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that research with us.
Yeah, that was incredible to see. Thank you for that. I've never seen that data before, honestly. This question really kind of had me for a loop a little bit. I think it's a great question, but it made me really kind of reflect on the last year. And I think I didn't really have, it was mostly psychological for me. I think working from home is definitely a privilege, pure and simple. And having that privilege, I just respected that. And I was like, I don't have as much leeway to complain. You know, people have it way harder during this pandemic. But for me, it was mostly psychological. And I think I shared that with several people during the pandemic. There was, you know, anxiety, like boredom. There's the sedentary nature of working from home. There's the removal of a disconnect between working and home. So home feels like work and work feels like home. You start working later than you ever would because it's there. It's just a click away. And I think that's kind of dangerous. However, moving forward, it would be nice for companies to be flexible. Yeah, support workers who choose to work from home. Some people like it and they do well there. That's great. Some people have, issues with being in public spaces. In the modern American office, it can be oppressive. Like you're always being observed in an open office, right? You never have privacy, and people like to encroach on your space, and there can be any number of reasons why you feel more comfortable working from home. Maybe you don't like to travel an hour to get to work. Like there's so many benefits to working from home. So I think it's up to offices to, supplement employees who need to work from home or prefer to work from home, but don't have the means to upgrade an entire office on a whim because a pandemic happened. I think there should absolutely be some sort of fund or scholarship just ready for that. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been thinking about.
Yeah.
Now, I think that most of us kind of just made it work, whatever situation we were in prior to COVID, right? Long hours at the office, it was just part of the deal, a lot of traveling, it was just what we had to do. And we just made sense of it, and just part of our task, right? And I was guilty of it. And it wasn't until everything shut down that I realized how much I was missing at home. And, I think I've been in a lot of conversations with colleagues and peers where we just talk about the balance that we found that we didn't realize we didn't have, if that makes sense. And my wife and I have three kids. We've got a full house, and I thought I was being present, right? Like I'd go and come back, and I was focused on being present, but not to the level that I can be in this situation where it's a hybrid. And our team has been working from home for most of the year. We've been going in a little bit here and there, but we're a design team, so we have to go in to go look at prototypes, and the collaboration factor is there. You can't necessarily do it on Zoom calls or team calls all the time. Sometimes you have to be together, and it works. And we've kind of embraced this hybrid work model, and hopefully that we can continue that way. But if there's anything, Amy, to your question, what we've learned is that we can be productive, and probably even more so because the balance creates this, I guess, this happiness of overall life that you can bring into the office. You're not disgruntled when you're going in because you're working, to the bone. You're balancing it all out throughout the day.
I think.
Yeah, so I saw a comment. Okay, thank you. Oh, no, I'm just, go ahead, my Wi-Fi cut out, but you can go ahead. Okay, well, I was gonna kind of switch it because in my world, it's opposite. Like, it's a privilege to not be at home. Because schools is the most important thing. You can see in Philadelphia, the public schools haven't opened for the entirety of the pandemic. But I go to a private school, and we've tried as hard as possible to be open. And that really comes down to the amount of space we have because of smaller classrooms. Well, it's designed for smaller classrooms so that we have enough space to safely accommodate everyone 6 feet apart, and we have enough space for people to eat lunch 6 feet apart, all that. But public schools and a lot of other schools across the country don't have that, and that's pretty much been one of the primary.
Yeah, I think Juniper's internet is cutting out a little bit there, but yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Honestly, the fact that there is a level of privilege associated with folks who can go to a private school, or even folks who go to like some of the suburban public schools, right? Like just different resources, access to amount of space, even budget comes into play here. And so, to the original question, like, the school building is an equalizer for issues like this, right? Like the kids who are at home, who don't necessarily have like top-notch internet, they don't have somewhere that is like a desk to work at, especially if their family is also working from home too. It's like, that physical space that's devoted to this activity, it really does equalize a lot of people's individual issues, right?
Yeah, I think Juniper was making a really important point for adults too, that you know, we need socialization. I mean, we are human animals, or social animals, and we require that for our well-being. And for a lot of us, work is a place where we have our communities, because sometimes that community doesn't exist physically in our village or our city. And so for a lot of us, those relationships, those friendships is something that we build and nurture when we're able to be together physically. You don't have to be physically together every single day of the week. You know, so there's no reason why a hybrid strategy can't be successful, as long as the organizations that are doing it with keeping in mind that everybody has a different experience and different situations. You know, I'm lucky I was able to steal a guest room. I'm lucky that I have a guest room in a house that I could take over and be one of those people that have a dedicated home office. But I think we just have to be aware that there's so many people who don't have those that level of control over their environment, and for them it can be really difficult for them to be able to be fully productive, and then it just sets them back in terms of their career, their earning potential, all of those things. And I think it's just one of those little hidden things that we need to be aware of as we think over the long term about how people are going to work going forward.
I think that's really well said. And I hope that we, you know, those of us on this call who design space, I hope, and interact with clients too, I hope that, you know, this inspires all of us. I know it inspired me to start thinking about how everybody's work from home experience is so different. And, you know, the office space, the hospital, you know, wherever people work, wherever people are educated, where you spend the majority of your time during the day that isn't your home can really be that safe and equal space. And it's kind of up to us to make that exist in an equitable way for people. Awesome. Does anyone mind if I move to the next question?
I just want to say I'm sorry for all that.
It's totally okay. You cut out at a good time. We got the majority of what you were saying.
Okay, perfect.
No worries. All right. I'll move to the next question here. So topic number 4. Excuse me, get the Zoom video out of here. All right, number 4, ability and created space. Most Americans are somewhat used to the existing given of architecture and design space. Instead of questioning whether the built space actually serves people, many designers and architects are confronted with the prompts of redesign our existing office, we need more conference rooms, or this hospital needs a new wing and expansion that is very similar to the existing building. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law, not a code, which helps us to design to the baseline standards of comfort and safety for people with disabilities. And the aim is to help them function within created space as normally as possible. The rest falls on the disabled person to figure out how to exist in a corporate office within an urban skyscraper, or to find a contractor who will install a ramp on their house to mediate a measly 3 inches of grade. In 2016, there were over 6,500 Title III lawsuits implicating private businesses for not complying with ADA standards, proving that individuals with disabilities still have to fight for the built environment to recognize them. What more can we do to create truly barrier-free space for people with disabilities, many of whom have spent their lives negotiating with the inherently unnatural built environment? How can we do more than what ADA asks of us and create a space that works for everyone? All right, who would like to go first on this one? I think it's it's a similar style of question to you know, our topic about restrooms, right? It's about you know, making space equal, right, and accessible for people, especially when you know, we exist in a built environment that quite literally does not exist in nature. You know, we make it, and so we are the ones who can control the outcome. It's just, you know, we're bucking nature, right, by building space. What do you get?
I heard a talk recently from Liz Ogbu, who described the expert citizen concept, the idea that every person is an expert in something. And I think this totally applies here. We need to find basically exclusion experts. That's what Kat Holmes calls people who have the most to lose or gain with like decisions like this, like who uses this space? What does it mean to them? I think this is where the collaboration aspect of design comes in. We don't necessarily know what's best, we're just assuming. But if you can sit down with people who have stake in it, who use this every single day, you know what to do and how to better navigate it. We can't assume when we design, we have to talk, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I have two sort of personal experiences, one at work and one at home. We were, prior to the pandemic, we were redesigning our entry space, our lobby, and the bathrooms. And we were working with an interior designer. And, you know, without having spoken to her about what the requirements or the needs were, ADA requirements, I mean, I wouldn't have known, you know, and I think a lot of it is being informed, and to Reuben's point, talking to the people that either are going to use it or designing those spaces that are well versed in creating those spaces. And so there were a lot of things that maybe we had thought we'd wanted, but at the end of the day, they weren't as important as making sure the needs were met of whoever was going to use it. And similarly, when my wife and I were looking at updating a bathroom in our house, and we have some close friends that has a daughter in a wheelchair, and we were asking, you know, if you come to visit, like what are things that we need to take into consideration? And in our situation, we weren't able to do it because there were some foundational things we couldn't do. But again, to Reuben's point, is we didn't know, but we knew we wanted to do it, right? And unfortunately, we couldn't. But there was a lot more involved than just than we thought. But we wouldn't have known if we didn't ask.
You know, one of the things that I was thinking of as you were talking, Amy, is some fairly simple kind of principles, you know, in terms of how do we create spaces where everybody can see and be seen. And whether you're sighted or not, I don't mean that so literally, but I mean that spaces where, you know, we can recognize the individual and their presence is there and is felt, but also they can have an impact as well. And the idea that, you know, they can hear and be heard, because a lot of times in situations where people do have different abilities, the idea of actually being able to be heard within whatever environment that you're in, that people again recognize you and acknowledge you. So I mean, those are just a couple things that I was thinking about in relationship to, you know, what might be some guiding ideas to think about.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. Go ahead, Juniper.
Oh, sorry. So I also agree with what you're kind of saying about making it more like validating, because I think that even with a lot of the regulations, many of the ramps are like tucked in the back, or, you know, it's like kind of added on as an afterthought, and it's very clearly because they have to do it, which I think can be insulting and inconvenient. But if you make buildings where like accommodations for disabled people are more prominent and centered in the design and thought through, like put thought into them, it can be much more visually appealing as well as like much more validating towards people with disabilities.
Okay. I think that's great. I'd like to move on to our final question in our last 15 minutes here. Is that okay with everybody?
Sure. Okay,
great. So our final topic of the evening is about erasure and credit. In 1966, a US-backed military coup overthrew the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. One of the first moves of the new regime was to burn as many pieces of the country's burgeoning film industry as possible, a stunning cultural erasure. Today, the country struggles to regain its footing in an industry it pioneered on the continent. The many students of the Ghanaian film industry spread out around Africa and ignited popular film industries in several other countries. One of the most insidious tools of oppression is the exclusion and erasure from historical record. As designers and architects, we are educated about the impact of visionaries like Le Corbusier and all of the others on the screen who are all white, but we have to seek out an education on icons like Paul Revere Williams, the first African-American member of the AIA. As artists, we are formally taught to revere European masters of art and sculpture, many of whom arrived at their groundbreaking designs through immersion in it and creative theft of often ignored cultures. The Eurocentric record of creative achievement is not only celebrated in design education, but positioned as the central canon for the entire world's creative output. How can designers reckon with the histories, credit, and contributions of marginalized peoples, both in practice and in standard education curricula? Are there policies that we can enact to combat this erasure, and what can be done in our local communities and projects to celebrate the true histories of art and its success in building diverse and welcoming communities? I'd love to pitch this to you, Reuben.
Sure. Do you mind if I share my screen real quick?
Please.
All right. Let me know when you see it.
Yep, you're good.
All right, great. So I thought the easiest way to answer this question was to just kind of talk about what my group does. I'm part of Designing in Color. We are an award-winning group of basically cultural architects. We don't think of ourselves as just designers. We try to design a culture of empathy. There are 6 of us, 3 co-founders, myself, Chris Locke, and Apalia Mead, as well as our associates, Jonathan Sharp, Olga Bracamontes, and Brian Wisniewski. We're located all over the US, so as you can imagine, team meetings are a joy to schedule. Our kind of key idea is to challenge, collaborate, and create. Challenging involves identifying issues. Collaboration, obviously, is working with different organizations and social groups to solve the problem. And create often means creating a platform or a safe space to actually address these issues and talk. And to the question, our current workshop series is called Designing with Action, and it's all about racialized architecture, identifying what it is and how to undo it. And part of that is in the education of architecture, the curricula. It's inherently flawed. It's very Eurocentric. It doesn't take into account a lot of the world, frankly, as it teaches architects. So as you emerge from architecture, your definition of beauty has already been shaped by a problematic base, and it's up to you to unlearn all that you spent 3 or 4 years learning. All that student loan debt taught you a completely skewed vision of architecture. And as we present this idea to firms, I've seen clients, their eyes widen. They've been teaching for 30 years or they've been practicing for decades, and they never thought about that. And I think it's because racism and racialized architecture in general, it's like a warm bath. You don't know when you're in it, you only know when you get out of it. It's that transition that hurts, and that's what we want to create. We want to create uncomfortable situations because it makes people reckon with what is happening and what's going on. So in the past, we like to put on panels. Critically too, we have something called a DCO griot. So the griot is a West African storyteller. The griot is so critical to West African culture that if you were to steal the griot in olden times, you would automatically, it's a declaration of war. You would go to war with that community because that's a walk-in historical record. So we consider any interview with a community or a major designer basically a griot. They're griots. They're giving us their narratives, their structures, their ideas, their thought processes, and that's what we use to design. So this year alone, we've had the privilege of speaking to Queer in the Parks, an initiative in Chicago, who told us about how space affects them and just ways to design pro-LGBTQIA+ spaces. All of these videos are on our account if you want to take a look at them. But basically, I just wanted to quickly introduce that as I round back to the question. So I think given a platform to artists and designers of color is so critical. That's the best way to undo erasure, because there is just an assumption that Eurocentric canon is the canon. And it shouldn't be the onus of marginalized peoples to prove they were there or they existed. All of last year was really tough for me as a designer of color because on top of dealing with the psychological burden of all the murder that was constantly on the news, all the injustice, I also was not explicitly, but implicitly assumed to be a sounding board for others who have just discovered that racism is a thing. I got so many calls from people who were like, oh my gosh, man, I had no idea it was that bad. And it's like, really? It's been hundreds of years of oppression, and it just took this one thing that happens frequently, by the way, to suddenly make you realize that racism exists. And I chuckle about it now because this happens every couple of years. It's not new. And I think this sort of, like, it's always up to communities of color to wait for typically white communities to pay attention to them. And I think this applies to design in the same way. When we think about design, we never think about designs that are international. We always limit our views to the West. So we talk about restrooms that don't work here, and then we go to another country and they work. And there's a reason for that. It's because we have a bubble of thought that starts from when you're schooled to when you start practicing, and it's up to us to break through that bubble. In terms of policy, I think that's the hardest thing. That's the thing that my group and I are trying to change, and it's difficult. Activism now, I think, is absolutely based on what policies that you actually enact. We're working with the AIA right now to try our hardest to make something happen, and it's very difficult to do. I don't even know what it would look like. Is it a standard to people have to push for diversity and inclusion? Is it as simple as just enacting safe space in an office? Like, how you design, is that justice in and of itself? Frankly, I don't think there is a clear answer, but I think it's just important that everyone does something and at least gives platforms to communities of color and at least tries to be an ally. I think a lot of D&I initiatives are great, but there's a danger that they'll co-opt and usurp rather than ally. So I think it's incredibly critical to work with communities that have been doing this for decades, and you only just heard about them like last year. It's not fair to assume that you can supersede them, work with them, see where you can slot into their plans, give your platform of 10,000 people over to them for a week. Let them just talk. I think that's what we need right now.
I'm a little speechless. I'm just gonna say, like, I'm like that blew me away. Thank you so much for sharing what you're doing and how you're thinking about that. And I guess I know, even though Amy's our official moderator, I would love to learn more about how to avoid those pitfalls of kind of co-opting versus being a true ally. You know, this has been something that we've been talking about a lot in our industry. And, you know, I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Oh yeah, happy to. It's really as simple as listening, communicating. That's really all it takes. I think a lot of firms attempt to do that. They'll maybe meet once or twice and then call it a day and then go off and design without that cultural context. But it's more about the citizen expert, right? Communities are experts in their community. They know what they need. They're there. You know, we can't design in such a way that we're just dumping a built form into a space without concern for who's there, who experiences, who gets to actually use that space. I think there's that critical balance that we as designers need to strike. The same way we work closely, you know, owner, architect, contractor, like that relationship needs to include the community, right? They need to have a say in what we're building in their space. Otherwise, you continue to get slums, you get Pruitt-Igoe, you get ghettos, you get all these issues are sort of rooted in a placelessness of kind of modernist design theory. It's just, I can do anything and put it there because this is the European canon, this is the Eurocentric canon that I've been taught, and I've been taught it works, and I don't care where it goes because this is beautiful to me, therefore it must be beautiful to them. And that's not true. So rather than just dumping built forms anywhere, it's important to interact with the community and make sure they're constantly part of the process, not just a cursory design meeting where you take 1 or 2 words and then ignore it. There has to be a reciprocal exchange, and design is, I think anyway, it's democratic. It's open to everybody. Everyone can be a designer. Everyone is a designer, and that elitist quality of architecture has to stop.
I love that.
I think that's extremely well said. And I have to say, I really resent the fact that in my 4 years of extremely expensive education, I was only taught about people like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and all of the other people I had on the screen, because not a single one of those people like meant anything to me, right? Because there's never any like emotional component to the stories that you hear about some of those people. And like, you know, I can say personally that like the designs that have meant the most to me are from people like Phil Freelon. Like, you know, I showed him on the screen, and like, you know, some of his work is so poetic, so rooted in history, rooted in struggle and in culture. That's something that you can't replicate without doing it an extreme injustice. And so I sincerely hope that you know, all of us work to begin affecting change like that in education. I can say personally that next time an educator invites me to be a part of their studio or for a critique or something, I'm going to make sure that I go prepared with a view that is not rooted in Eurocentrism. I would like to go to give examples to students of work that actually reflects an equitable and democratic worldview versus what I was taught in school. I would like to begin changing that. And I think that all of us can affect that in some way, right?
I think you're right, Amy. I think it begins with the education system, you know, and design school. I mean, I didn't study architecture, but after being in the industry for so long, all of the, you know, well-known architects are the ones that I reference when I'm looking at design inspiration. But you know, in terms of just global design, like we don't really talk about that in school, you know, whether it's architecture, interiors, or like in my world, product and textile design. I mean, I guess textile design, we think about how global cultures have influenced textile techniques. But I was talking to a colleague, and he was asking me, he's like, surely you think about, you know, your heritage when you're thinking about product design or whatever. And I said, no, not really, because, you know, all of the references to what goes on in our industry don't really speak to it, you know, like, and I felt ashamed. I was like, why don't I, you know? And I guess I just been trained to go to the same well that we all go to, right? And I think that somehow, and I hate to sound this way, but I almost felt like, man, can it really happen? But somehow we've got to get that piece, that element into our design training, you know, maybe there's parts of it where it is the influences by great American architects or designers, but there is from, you know, great Asian architects and designers that we probably never even heard of, you know, that have brought so much to the table that we don't even recognize we're utilizing or using. But I do hope, Amy, that dialogue gets stronger.
I'd like to also thank Reuben for what he said. And I also, for what everyone else is saying, I do think there is influence of other cultures in design, but it's kind of appropriated, which is a discussion, you know, I've had a lot, cultural appropriation. But that's really just the only point I wanted to make. It's just like a very westernized view of other cultures.
Yeah, great. Thank you all for your responses to that. I agree. I think that's part of why Afrofuturism is sort of in vogue right now. People reference Black Panther as sort of the, you know, genesis of that, but it's been around for a long time. But it's cool to at least see that style of thinking, that imagining that Black people are in the future, which shouldn't be that crazy, but tends to be. It's exciting just to see new ideas come from that design thinking, frankly.
Very cool.
I cannot thank all four of you enough for agreeing to come here, helping me craft the questions, sharing, sometimes personal stories. I am so appreciative, and I would love to just take a question or two if anybody has them, from the audience. There's so many great anecdotes and comments being sent in the chat about, personal experiences that relate to a lot of what we're talking about here. And yeah, I'm extremely appreciative of everyone's participation tonight too. Does anyone have any burning questions? You don't have to type it. You can just come off mute too if you want to. And of course, no pressure.
Hi, my name is Wes. I'm actually joining you guys from Wisconsin, so it's pretty cool to be around such an awesome community of designers from so far away. But I wanted to ask really about the idea of like self-reflection in good design. Oftentimes, what I consider to be good design are things that I can relate to, and I have to stretch myself as an individual to relate to things that aren't always within sort of my universe of thought. But going back to the piece about education and really kind of helping to expand people's thinking for where good design can come from, I just wonder about how you've battled the idea of self-reflection as being the metric for good design, and how good design can be unrelatable in some cases. So just wondering how you find inspiration when you can't always relate to the topic or relate to the subject matter.
That's a great question. I'll take a stab at it first, if you guys don't mind. Well, personally, I think that I know that when I'm going through the design process, there's inevitably the goal of providing the need for the user or the user. And so a lot of times where it might start with a very personal experience or inspirational, point, I myself, and I think I'll speak for the design team that I work with, we kind of foster this idea of taking this inspiration to a point where we know we have to give it away, right? And when we do that, or as we're doing that, we know that it's not ours. And so we can appreciate the work that's been put into it, but ultimately it's not for us to keep, it's for others to use, enjoy, whatever it might be. So I guess seeing the work that's been put into it might be that point of self-reflection, but other than that, we know it needs to work and be valuable for whoever is partaking in it. Does that kind of answer your question in a way?
I asked because I don't have an answer. So thank you.
I'm sure some of these other panelists would have other things to add. Well,
I was just going to say, Wes, I mean, your question, it made me think a lot, because, what I feel very grounded in is this notion of human-centered design or user-centered design. And, the key principles of that is really trying to get into the heads, the bodies, the experiences of the people for whom we're designing. I'm not personally a designer, but work with design every day of my life. And all of that is about really, empathy just feels like it's a word that gets used so much lately. I'm not sure I love it anymore, but in its truest sense, empathy of really trying to understand what the experience is of those people, for whom we're creating spaces or whatever it is that we're creating experiences, et cetera. And that can be really difficult to do because where self-reflection is really important, sometimes to really gain empathy, you do have to kind of put yourself aside, because as humans, it's natural for us to relate most closely to our experience. what we know and what we've learned. And yet it feels like truly good design is based not as much in that, but based in really trying to reflect the understanding and the experience of the people for whom we're creating these things. And that's hard to do. It is hard, really hard to get into somebody else's head.
And Chris, I agree with you. I think it's all about this take on empathy, this empathic design. And I think until there's a better word, that's the word, right? That's the thought. It's like,
Yeah.
Otherwise it would just be a selfish sort of artistic take on whatever we're doing professionally, right? But
yeah,
it is, and you're right. And I don't mean to sound trite, but it is all very human centered. It is. I mean, that's what it's all about. It's not for our personal gain, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's where I think earlier in the conversation where, sometimes we, like the Le Corbusier or Frank Lloyd Wright or whoever it is we're celebrating. I mean, there's a lot of ego there, right?
Yeah.
It's like, and it was a lot about the self and wanting to do what makes me, as a projection of my ego versus trying to, subvert my ego a little bit and leave that at the door and think about the other person. So.
Yeah.
I love those answers. That's great. And I think for me, my team and I always try to design with narrative. So it's very similar to what everyone else was saying, but it's just thinking about how would what we're designing fit into the story of this community or this space or these people. And I think that helps us dissociate from the ego a little bit more. It's the same way you can go and see a film on an experience you've never experienced and feel touched by it. I saw Minari recently and it was beautiful. I have no idea what that experience is like, but I empathized with it just by experiencing the story and the storytelling. And I think that helps me anyway, design as well, to think about where does what I'm doing fit into their narrative. I'm not appropriating their story. I'm just a small part of it and trying to help tell it in a helpful way, I guess.
All right. I appreciate all those answers to that question. I think that was a great question, and I loved all the different perspectives from each of the panelists here. I think that since we're 5 minutes past the 90-minute mark, maybe we call it quits for the night. I think we've tackled a lot of really hard conversations, and of course we only scratched the surface, and there is just so much more to talk about. But again, I just have to thank the panelists so much. Thank you everyone for your great participation and interest in the event, and have a wonderful night. I hope that this inspired everyone too.
Thank you, Amy.
Well,
thank you for having us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
of course. All right.